Okay guys, part 2 of the video. Talk about the correlational method of research. Two types of research, correlational and correlational and experimental. Correlational method is a research method that uses statistical techniques to determine the degree of a relationship between variables. Just because two things are related doesn't mean one thing causes another. There are a lot of behaviors and issues that coincide, but one doesn't necessarily cause the other. I did mention in class about how sometimes people in lower socioeconomic statuses might report higher incidences of depression. If that's true or not, we still need to make sure we address it. Because we can't argue that lower socioeconomic status causes depression. We have to control for some stuff. The correlational method just looks at how two things are related. The degree of relationship between variables. So you have a coefficient of correlation, which is a statistic used to describe the degree of a relationship between two or more variables in which positive correlations indicate positive correlations indicate that variables vary together at the same direction, and negative correlations indicate the opposite. So if you have two variables increasing in the same direction, varying in the same direction, that means as one variable increases, the other variable increases. That's known as, look where I'm pointing my finger, a positive correlation. Okay? Now a perfect positive correlation is +1. This is a one-to-one thing. For instance, two things that vary pretty well, pretty highly, are things like academic achievement and time spent studying. Now, it's not a perfect one-to-one correlation because we have people out there who are really good at studying quickly. Very good at studying in an hour, quick to grasp material, and quick to finish. Now, let's say you have things that are of no relationship. These are two things that aren't related at all, such as height and weight. 200 pounds looks very different on someone who is, let me say, 5'1", and there are people who are 200 pounds and 6'2". Those two things very rarely coincide. However, there's something known as a negative correlation, which means it's whenever one thing increases, the other decreases. Now, that can be referring to something like one thing increases, the other increases. As one thing increases, the other decreases. That could be referring to something such as, let's say, auto value plus mileage, with mileage driving. Like, the higher you drive your car, the more miles you put in your car, the less you're able to sell it for. Right? That's considered a negative correlation. The more mileage, the less value. Alright. Now, you have a strong correlation and a weak correlation. All I want you to know is what a perfect positive correlation looks like, which is +1. The coefficient of correlation looks like for no relationship. Things like height and weight, beauty and intellectual achievement, things like that. Eye color and intelligence and charisma, two things that are not related at all. Now, there's such things as weak correlations, things that are close to 0. Anything between 0 and 0.5 or -0.5 and 0. Those are all considered weak correlations. The closer to 0, the weaker the correlation is. So something that might have a -0.3 correlation would be something like, I would say that would be a height and weight example. That would have a very low relationship. Now, drinking and dexterity tests. I'm sorry this is a little blurry, you guys. The higher the number of drinks, the worse you'll score on a dexterity test. Let's say you have 2 drinks. Well, there might be a third variable here, right? People with higher tolerance for alcohol tend to do better on dexterity tests when they've been drinking, especially just a little bit. So arguably, the more and more you drink, the less and less you'll score on a dexterity test. Okay? I want you to understand that's what correlation is. The more you drink, the less you score on a dexterity test. Now, there's all sorts of variables going on here, like whether or not you've had something to eat before you start drinking, or your just dexterity before you started drinking, because you might not have good dexterity in the first place. So there's a whole bunch of mitigating variables here. So drinking doesn't necessarily cause this dexterity loss, or at least not at first, depending upon your level of, or your ability to drink. Now, a positive correlation. You can argue for the most part, time spent studying tends to have a positive correlation with student grades. The more you study, the higher your grades. This is, like I said before, this is not true of everyone. There are third variables involved here, such as intelligence, time it takes to get something, amount of homework, so on and so forth. Now I'm going to go over some things here. Example of negative correlation here is auto value and auto mileage. Auto mileage, auto value. Now, the more the mileage, the lower the value, right? This is increasing, this is increasing. So let's say you have high auto mileage, you have lower auto value. The greater the auto value, the lower the mileage. Very important, you guys. So you know, the greater the mileage that is on the car when you try to sell it, the less likely you are to be able to sell it. A zero correlation are things like body color and quality. Now, while it takes, while it tends to be more expensive to own a red car in general, or men for some reason tend to have higher insurance premiums than women do, those are 2 things that aren't really related to the quality of the auto that you buy. So, color, quality, 2 things that aren't related. Notice how the dots are kind of scattered everywhere here. Sorry. The dots are kind of scattered everywhere, so there's no general trend line for the data. Just everywhere. Now, auto insurance cost is positively correlated with auto accidents. I know this personally, because after I got in my accident, my auto premiums skyrocketed up $300 every 6 months. In the end, not too bad, but kind of put a good dent in my finances. So, the more auto accidents you have, the higher your insurance premiums are going to be, at least at first. Now, let me make something clear. Correlation does not mean causation. Just because 2 things are related doesn't mean one causes the other. Just because in the general population you'll see people who study more tend to have better grades. That doesn't imply everybody. Because like I said, you have to take into account intelligence, diet, things like that, physical health. There's all sorts of things that you have to control for in order to determine what causes people to have higher GPAs. You have to pay attention to any third factors that might be involved. For example, let's say people are out because it gets colder. When it gets colder, you see more and more students being absent, dropping out, not being in class. So, in that situation, what might be a third factor? It could be simply because these kids are they're stuck around with people who are sick already and they're forced inside. In winter, you don't go outside and play a lot, especially not in the South, if you know what I mean. It gets all rainy, and rain and cold do not mix. In that case, the third factor involved in the people dropping out and the loss of temperature could be people in close contact getting sick. So the correlational method is just to determine whether the degree to which two things are related. Just because things are related highly doesn't mean one causes the other. We're just determining a relationship between variables. So if we have a high degree of a relationship between variables, we can start looking for a causal link. For instance, two things that don't, we would never study the effects of, maybe we never really studied the effects on social economic status and depression. Those two things might actually have no effect on each other. But in order to determine that, we have to probably do a correlational study first before we start going into causational research. Experimental research is research that is conducted in precisely controlled laboratory conditions, in which participants are controlled with specific stimuli, and their reactions are carefully measured to discover relationships among variables. What I mean to say is that while correlation groups just look at the relationships between two variables, they're still testing a hypothesis. As one increases, the other increases. If you're doing causal research, we're determining what causes depression symptoms to be reduced, what causes problems to be fixed, what causes people to be in certain situations and have certain issues. So, like correlational research, experimental research involves a hypothesis that must be tested. Now, unlike we're just looking at the relationships between variables, we address a cause and an effect. The independent variable is a cause. It's a condition or factor that the experiment manipulates in order to determine whether there are changes in the behavior, the dependent variable. Okay? The behavior you're trying to look at will always be the dependent variable. Let's say you're talking about the study of socioeconomic status on depression. Well, in this case, socioeconomic status is something that, we're trying to measure against. So, the behavior in this case is depression. So the behavior will be the independent variable. This is what we're measuring for. Okay? The dependent variable is the effect. This is considered depression. The independent variable is X. The independent variable is X, and that is, in this case, socioeconomic status. We're grouping people in terms of socioeconomic status in this case and determining their levels of depression in each group. Now, in this case, you have an experimental group and a control group. And every time you do experimental groups, you have to have a control group to measure them against. The experimental group is a group of participants who are exposed to different varieties of independent behaviors that they can be compared to. The control group is a group of participants who experience all the same conditions as participants in the experimental group, except for the key factor, the independent variable, the researcher is evaluating. In this case, guys, I'm simply talking about studying the effects of drugs on depression. Now, I'm not talking about drugs like marijuana. My high schoolers did not understand that. They didn't know that's not what I meant. I'm talking about things like Seroquel, Paxil, things like that. Drugs that are, typically used as antidepressants. There's a whole bunch of them. Seroquel is mostly used as like either an antipsychotic or an anti-manic, but I'm not sure which. So let's say we're trying to test a new study in depression that has 200 volunteers. Okay? Now, the hypothesis that 705 milligrams of drug X will result in 50% decrease in depressive symptoms. What I mean to say is that we're hoping that if we give people the drug, they're going to reduce their symptoms by 50%. Which is awesome. This is what we want. So the independent variable is the drug. The dependent variable is the 50% decrease. Anytime you're talking about a behavior, that will always be the dependent variable. Okay? The experimental group has 100 participants. See 75 milligrams of drug X. The control group is 100 participants receive a placebo. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what a placebo is, it's basically a sugar pill. The placebo effect has been proven valid by many studies. This is when you take a pill and told it's going to make you feel better. So you thenceforth report better feelings even though nothing in your body has actually changed. A lot of times vitamins serve this purpose as a placebo effect. Now I take vitamins and I'm cool with that. Vitamins work for me, but that's because my body needs them. I have a deficiency of iron in my blood. Now, sometimes vitamins act as a placebo pill. You say, I take vitamins, I feel better. Well, the vitamins aren't necessarily being absorbed in your body because you already have those vitamins. So, if you take the vitamin, the placebo pill might actually be working. In this case, 100 participants are given the actual drug, drug X. The other participants are given a placebo white pill that looks like drug X, and they're just told that's what it is. Now, we're trying to look at the end of the study and see, okay, how good do these people feel? Do these people report a 50% depression? Well, we have to pay attention because the participants in drug X experience a decrease in their depression, while only a small number of those in placebo also experience a decrease in depression. And the drug is successful. Okay? If an equal number of participants in experimental and control groups have decrease in depression, the drug is unsuccessful. So let's say there's more people in the placebo group feel better than the people who are actually taking the drug. That's also not good. You want to make sure that the actual drug's effects are better than the placebo effect. Because the drug you're giving them is no better than a sugar pill, you might as well just toss it out the window because it's going to be no good. So you want to make sure that the results are representative if you're studying for an experiment. If you're gathering a sample, the sample must be representative of the population. The results are limited if they're not representative. Random samples allow for greater inclusion of participants. And once selected, participants are often randomly assigned to groups. So like I said, if I'm going to do a study on depression and the effects of drugs on depression, I'm going to make sure I get people actually diagnosed with depression. That's just, that's just how it's done. You want to make sure it's representative. Also, you want to make sure you have an equal amount of boys and girls. You want to make sure you get people from all different social economic statuses. You want to try to get as many people of the general population as possible. So you can randomly assign them to groups once you get the sample correct. There's two types of psychological experiments that I would like to talk to you guys about today. I'm going to go over ethics with you. Ethics is very important. These two studies, the Milgram study and the Stanford University prisoner study, are done before ethics were developed in like the 90s and 80s and things like that. The Milgram study is very important because it studied deception. It used deception. Got a whole bunch of naive participants off the street, showed them into kind of a laboratory setting with a series of switches and someone to ask questions to on the other end of a little, kind of like a screen where you can see them. Now, their job, or so they were told, was to ask the other person a question. And if the person got the question wrong, they were to flip a switch and shock them with at first 15 volts. Every time the person would get a subsequent question wrong, they would strike 15 volts higher. So 15, 30, 45, so on and so forth, all the way up to 350. Now, basically, guys, they were told that they're studying the effects of punishment on learning in the study. So when they got up to about 100 volts, some of the participants, or all the participants in the other end that they couldn't see, shouted, "Oh, I have a heart condition. Please stop shocking me." and they kind of threw a panic attack almost. Now, the very key thing that happened here is a lot of the people who were off the street looked up at their experimenter as to what to do. And the experimenter in his lab coat said, "You really must go on. The experiment requires that you must continue." Now, 65% of the people shocked the learners all the way up to 350 volts. 65% of the people. Now, one thing you need to understand about the experiment is that no one was actually being shocked. The naive participants off the street believed they were shocking people, but the people on the other end were just actors, pretending to be shocked. They didn't know that until they were debriefed. They were told at the end of the study, "Hey, this is what was really happening. You didn't really shock anybody. I told you this." That's all it was. It's no big deal. No one really got shocked, but that would kind of mess me up a little bit, you know? So in the end, over 60% of people participating in the study shocked the people on the other end all the way up to 350 volts after they started protesting. Now, one thing I didn't tell you about the Milgram experiment is that at some point, all they heard on the other end is white noise. Like, they kept shocking them to maybe up to 250 volts, and then there was dead silence. They kind of presumed to know that they killed someone. That would be kind of freaky, for me. But then there's the Stanford University prisoner study. This talked about the effects of roles on people's behaviors. They got a whole bunch of healthy 18-year-old boys, randomly labeled prisoner guard, prisoner guard, prisoner guard. And the study took place in the basement of Stanford University. A guy named Zimbardo did this. What he did was he put a bunch of people, randomly labeled prisoner and guard. They kidnapped the prisoners from their homes, basically gave them real arrest, put them in like clothing, you know, with numbers. They didn't give them names, and imprisoned them. And they gave the guards positions of power, things like clubs, bats, things like that, badges. Eventually, even though these were normal 18-year-old boys, they started becoming the roles they were in. And it got hostile very quickly. The prisoners became submissive, and the guards became power-hungry. Now, because of the extreme violent nature of the results of the experiment, it had to be ended early. This happens before ethics was even developed, y'all. This is kind of what went down. And Zimbardo did it. It was a little bit cruel, the results of the experiment, the violence that came out as a part of it. There's a lot of violent outbursts in between, some rebelling, some brutality, I guess. But both of these were developed after, over 20 years after the Nazi trials. The Nazi agenda went down in the 40s. Because think about what happened when the Milgram study, they're really trying to study the effects of obedience on common people. Give people power, what do they do with it, you know? But that's the thing, they were just following orders. That's what the cry in the Nuremberg trial was. I was just following orders. I was just doing what they told me to do. And that's essentially what they were doing. Every time they heard any problem going on, the first thing they would do is look up to the lab experimenter to tell them what to do. That person was in a position of power. In the Stanford University prisoner study, random students were given a position of power and told to act it out, and encouraged to act it out. So give ordinary people power and watch what they do with it. The problem is there's very little control in these experiments, very little ethics backing it up, because this would not fly by an institutional review board today. I'm going to explain how that works. The American Psychological Association Ethical Guidelines. You're to avoid procedures that cause serious physical or mental harm to human participants. both the Milgram study and the Stanford University prison study would be very good candidates for being kicked out of the IRB. Investigators need to obtain informed consent. Basically, the study's gonna be mentally damaging because you're going to be going over a lot of material, things like that. A lot of studies done today are either done on a computer or done by answering a question of survey packets. A participant's right to be refused to participate at any time during the course of study is respected. Basically, you tell them that you can get up whenever you want to and there will be no harm to you if you choose not to participate. And confidentiality must be maintained. At no point is anybody's answer supposed to be linked to the demographic information you provide, name, date, whatever. Name, address, whatever that is, you don't link those two. You put them in a separate file. It might be attached to a number that is attached to the results, but you keep them separately. You don't spread that information around. It's kept under lock and key so nobody else can touch it. So you need to make sure the first thing that the person signs when they get into your experiment is the informed consent document. Okay? That explains these are the things that might happen to you. These are the things you might need to do if you have this experiment and you experience psychological distress. Counseling services are available to you. Deception remains controversial. In the Milgram study, the participants were told to study the effects of punishment on learning. That's what the study was about. In reality, they're trying to study the effects of obedience on behavior, of shows of power on obedience. So deception is still used today, but it remains controversial. If you try to do any sort of research, you have to present it to the IRB form. The IRBs exist at all institutions to ensure safety and well-being of research participants. These independent boards review all proposed studies. They try to figure out if it poses minimal risk to participants. So we talked about how we form studies, why we do it, what type of studies we talk about. Let's talk about statistical concepts. Now, statistics are the backbone for everything. Every science there is out there. So it's good that you understand the basics today. These are mathematical methods for describing and interpreting data. There are two types of statistics, descriptive and inferential. This is pretty much how you would imagine it to be. Descriptive statistics go over how you describe the data if you're looking at it. What's the mean, median, and mode? What's the standard deviation? And inferential statistics is pretty much explaining what can we infer from this data. Is this data successful? Is the study successful? Have we successfully refuted our hypotheses or accepted our hypotheses? Now there's descriptive statistics, which is reducing data to a form that can be easily understood. Talk about measures of central tendency. This is a value that reflects the middle or central point of a distribution of scores. Mean, median, and mode. The mean is just the arithmetic average. You do this every semester when you average your grades. You add up the scores and divide by the number. Median is when you line up the scores from smallest to largest and you figure out which one's in the middle. Just by putting on a number line. Bam. Mode. The score that occurs most frequently in a distribution of numbers. Now if you're doing a normal distribution, you guys, this is when you have the same amount of data above and below the mean. A normal distribution is in descriptive statistics a distribution in which scores are distributed similarly on both sides of the middle value, so they can have the appearance of a bell-shaped curve when graphed. In this case, you can have them skewed left or right. If you have a situation where there's extremely amount of high scores on an IQ test, you might be looking at a prep school or a grad school. Or you could be skewed with a whole bunch of data If it's left skewed, that means you have the majority of the data below the mean. If it's right skewed, you have the majority of the data below the mean. If it's left skewed, you have the majority of the data above the mean. So left skewed tends to have people who are, prep schools with really high IQ tends to score high in things like prep schools, gifteds, whatever. Right skewed tends to have a bunch of people who score below the mean, such as, I don't know, people who are in remedial programs, things like that. Let's talk about measures of variability, y'all. There's range and standard deviation. This talks about whether or not distribution scores are clustered closely around the average or widely spread out. Now, I can have, if I want to grade you on a bell curve, let's say I have a very small range. Let's say I have an 85 to 95 range in percentile in tests. Well, I won't really need to grade on a curve then, now would I? Because if I have a 10-point range of scores. That's the difference between highest and lowest means. Because I only have like 10-point range. I mean, I wouldn't need to grade on a curve, but let's say I had students who were like 45 points to 65 points. And I knew I wasn't getting any higher on my test scores than 65 points. Well, the highest person will get an A, and the lowest person will probably get an F. That's what they mean when they say grading on a curve. But teachers have different ways of curving their grades. Talking about standard deviation, talking about the measure of variability that scores typically deviate from the mean. Let's say I have a class of 80. I have a couple students scoring a 40 on a test, a couple students scoring like 110 on a test, but there's a lot of students scoring like a 75, 80, mostly B's and B's and C's, things like that. But I know that's like an even distribution, normal distribution of scores. Same amount of scores above and below the mean, for the most part. I can infer I might have standard deviation of like 5 or 6. That means scores typically deviate from the mean about 6 points above and below. So if I have one standard deviation above the mean, let's say the standard deviation of this data is 6. So let's say on average you score about a 75, 80. 75. Let's say that's your mean score. And it's a normal distribution, then there's 6 above. That's 81. 6 below is 69. To score between 69 and 81, that's one standard deviation above and below the mean in a normal distribution of scores. Okay? In that case, those scores would be the most common. Now, the higher the standard deviation is, the less likely the grades are going to be. The more atypical they're going to be. Talk about Stanford Binet IQ test, or I think it's a Whistler IQ test. The average is going to be 100. That's the mean if it's a normal distribution. 100 will be the X, the mean. And there's going to be 15 standard deviation above and below the mean, so it's going to be 85 to 115. That's going to be 30 points, 50 points above and below the mean. Now, if you have like 130 points, that's going to be slightly less typical. So 85 to 115 is going to be the most typical scores. A standard deviation basically refers to how typical the score is. That's all it is. And there's percentiles. This numbers in a range of data indicating percentages of scores in that lie below them. Let's say your class is measured. Your class is measured in terms of height. And you're in the 90th percentile when it comes to height in your class. That means 90% of your fellow students are shorter than you. Let's say you're in the 10th percentile. Means you're probably like 4-0 or something like that. That means 90% of your fellow students are going to be taller than you. Percentile indicates the range of data indicating percentages of scores that lie below it. Now, standard score is a measure of how much a score deviates from an average in standard units. So let's say I'm talking about the IQ test, and there's this, the mean is 15, and the standard deviation, the mean is 100, and the standard deviation is 15. So let's say 115 would be one standard deviation above the mean. 110 in this case would be like 0.66 would be your standard score if you're dealing with a normal distribution. Y'all, this is really complicated, so I'm just going to explain it as simply as I can. Standard scores are basically the relationship between how, it's basically your standard deviation, but it talks about how the score is related to the standard deviation. Let's say the standard deviation is 15, so you know if you have to score 115 to be at least one standard deviation above the mean. That means your scores aren't very typical. You didn't do very well. But let's say you get 110. Or let's say you get a score of 130. Score of 130 when the standard deviation is 15 means you did 2 standard deviations above the mean, which means you have a standard score of 2. Means you're above the mean. It means pretty much you have your scores are atypical. You did very well compared to everyone else being measured. Now, while descriptive statistics are meant to describe the data and describe individual data points, inferential statistics are about to draw conclusions about the meaning of research data. Now, this is also very important. If you want to study data, you can't just study how it looks like. You have to study what it means. That's the entire reason why we do it. So we have the concept of operational definition. We need this. We need to explain what these things mean. When we're talking about weight, we want to specify that we don't mean or obesity. If I want to study the effects of obesity, I have to define what obesity is. I have to talk about the certain weight-height relationship. I can't just talk about weight because that wouldn't be descriptive of obesity. That wouldn't properly operationally define obesity. Because we don't measure obesity just by weight. We can't put someone on a scale and say, oh, you're 130 pounds, you're obese. No, that's not how it works. Statistical significance is another type of inferential statistics. This is how we determine whether or not an experiment that we did is successful. This is the term to describe research results in which changes in the independent variable can be attributed with a high level of confidence to the experimental condition or independent variable that is being manipulated by the researcher. This is how we determine, okay, say we're talking about the effects of a drug X on depression. Well, okay, how do we measure that? Effects of drug X on depression. Well, we have to talk about the reduction of symptoms. But we have to get a 99% confidence level that that is correct. You get 0.01. You have a confidence level of 99%. That means there's a 0.01% chance of that data being just being a fluke. Not being attributed to what we're talking about in the study. So we do a calculation to determine, okay, is this information valid? Is the effects of the depression due to the drug? Is it due to the drug or is it due to a fluke? Is it just is it random or just completely abnormal oddity that this information happens the way it does? Because let's say I do have a higher reduction in symptoms in the depressed population with drug X than I did with the placebo. Well, that's what I want. But is it just a fluke that happened? or is it the results of the drug itself? We use statistical significance to determine what level of confidence we have that this works. So that's our p-value. If our p-value is above 0.01, we throw our results out the window. If it's below 0.01, we reject our null hypothesis. We know with a high level of confidence, a 99% level of confidence, that yes, drug X is the cause of depression symptom reduction. I just want you guys to know the difference between descriptive and inferential statistics. Another thing you need to know is that we do use means more than any other form of measure of central tendency, because we compare one group to the other. So if I were to be doing the experiment on drug X, I would be saying, okay, I can determine, I found the means in depression symptom reduction in the group with the drug X and the group with the placebo. I can infer with 99% probability, 99% confidence, that the effects of drug X on depression is due to the drug itself. Alright, you guys, that's the end of my lecture. Thank you for listening, and I know you're going to do well on the test. Have a good night.